The engines stopped all at once, and for 3 seconds nobody in that diner breathed. 400 riders stood shoulder to shoulder on Cherry Street, leather and chrome catching the Oklahoma sun, every single one of them staring through the glass at one young man in an apron who had no idea why they'd come. A silver-bearded stranger walked through the door first, stopped in front of him, and said 5 words that would change everything. "You're Curtis's boy, aren't you?" Nobody in that diner knew what he meant. Nobody knew what connected a mechanic who died 18 years ago to 400 bikers now filling the street outside. But they were about to find out. The bell above the door of Rosie's diner rang at exactly 6:15 every morning, the same time it had rung for Malcolm Whitfield for the last 4 years. He pushed through with his elbow, both hands full, a crate of clean coffee cups in one arm, a rolled apron tucked under the other, and called out the same greeting he called out every day. "Morning, Miss Darlene." "Morning, Hank." Darlene Combs, the diner's owner, didn't even look up from the grill. "Morning, sunshine," she said, the way she always did, flipping a stack of pancakes with a practiced flick of her wrist. Hank, the elderly regular who occupied the same stool at the end of the counter every single day, raised his coffee mug in salute without turning around. He didn't need to look. He knew the sound of Malcolm's sneakers on the tile, the particular rhythm of his walk, quick and a little rolling, like he was always excited to get somewhere. Malcolm was 24 years old, broad-shouldered, with a gap-toothed smile that seemed to arrive a half-second before anything else about him. He had Down syndrome, and he had worked at Rosie's diner since he was 20, ever since Darlene had taken a chance on him when nobody else in town would. He bussed tables, restocked napkin dispensers, refilled ketchup bottles, and greeted every single customer like they were the most important person to walk through that door all day. For most of Tulsa's East Side, Malcolm wasn't just part of the diner. He was the reason people came back. He set the crate of cups down behind the counter and began wiping down the laminate surface, humming a tune that didn't belong to any song in particular. Outside, the sky over Tulsa was still grey with early morning, the kind of grey that promised heat later, but hadn't decided yet. A truck rumbled by. Somewhere down the block, a garbage collector was working the alley behind the shops. "You see the paper?" Hank asked, not really expecting an answer, the way old men ask questions to fill silence rather than to get information. "I don't read the paper, Hank," Malcolm said cheerfully. "I read the specials board." Hank chuckled into his coffee. Smart man. Malcolm's mother, Loretta Hendricks, worked 2 blocks away at a laundromat, and most mornings she walked him to the diner before her own shift started, though Malcolm liked to remind her that he was a grown man and didn't need walking anymore. Loretta always smiled and let him have the sentence, even though she still watched from the corner until he was safely inside. She had raised Malcolm alone since he was 6, after his father, Curtis Whitfield, passed away. Curtis had been a mechanic and a veteran, a quiet man who'd spent 2 tours overseas and came home with very few words about what he'd seen. What Loretta remembered most was how patient he'd been with Malcolm, teaching him to tie his shoes on the porch for hours, never once raising his voice. Malcolm didn't remember much about his father, but he remembered the garage. He remembered the smell of motor oil and the sound of a wrench dropping on concrete and somebody's laugh, low and warm, that he could never quite place a face to anymore. By 7 o'clock, the diner had filled with its usual rhythm. Construction workers grabbing coffee before a shift, nurses coming off nights, an old couple who ordered the same 2 omelets every Tuesday and Thursday without looking at a menu. Malcolm moved between the tables with a stack of plates balanced against his forearm, a skill Darlene liked to brag about to new hires who couldn't manage half of what he could carry. It was around 8 that the trouble started, the way trouble sometimes does. Quietly at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. A man in a grey suit sat down at the counter, 3 stools from Hank, and set his phone down with a hard click against the laminate. He was maybe 40, clean-shaven, with the kind of haircut that cost more than most people in that diner made in a week. His name, though nobody in the diner would learn it until later, was Gregory Paulson, a regional sales manager passing through Tulsa for a 2-day conference, staying at the Hyatt downtown and utterly unfamiliar with Rosie's or its regulars. Malcolm approached with a menu and his usual bright greeting. "Morning. Welcome to Rosie's. Can I start you off with coffee?" Paulson glanced up, gave Malcolm a once-over that lasted a fraction too long, and then looked past him toward the kitchen. "Is there someone else who can take my order?" Malcolm blinked, still smiling, not quite understanding. "I can take it. I've worked here 4 years." "I'd just prefer someone else," Paulson said, his voice flat, dismissive, pitched just loud enough that the 2 men at the table behind him glanced over. No offense. Darlene's head came up from the grill like she'd heard a gunshot. Malcolm's smile faltered, just slightly, the way a candle flickers in a draft without quite going out. "Oh, okay. That's fine. I can get Miss Darlene." "Actually," Paulson said louder now, apparently deciding the moment called for an audience, "I just don't think it's very professional is all. Having someone like him handling the food. People are trying to eat." The diner went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet right before something happens. Forks paused halfway to mouths, a conversation cut off mid-sentence at the corner table, even the radio behind the counter seeming to turn itself down. Hank set his coffee mug down hard enough that it clinked against the saucer. Malcolm stood there for a moment, the menu still held out in front of him, his cheeks warm, his eyes doing that thing they did when he was trying very hard not to let something hurt him in front of other people. He'd heard comments before. Not often. Tulsa's east side had grown to love him the way a neighborhood loves its own, but often enough to recognize the shape of cruelty when it walked in wearing a nice suit and ordered black coffee. "I'll get you someone else," Malcolm said quietly, and turned toward the kitchen. What none of them knew, not Malcolm, not Darlene, not even Hank, who had lived on that street for 60 years, was that outside, parked along the curb 2 blocks down, a line of motorcycles was already beginning to gather, engines ticking as they cooled, more arriving by the minute, and that by the time the coffee in Gregory Paulson's cup went cold, Rosie's diner would look nothing like it did right now. Loretta Hendricks found out about it before Malcolm even had the chance to tell her. She was folding towels at the laundromat when her phone buzzed with a text from Darlene. "You need to come down here." Some man was rude to Malcolm. He's okay, but he's shook up. Loretta left the towels half folded on the counter and walked the 2 blocks faster than she'd walked anywhere in years, her chest tight with a particular kind of fury that only a mother protecting her child could summon. By the time she arrived, the diner had returned to something like normal, though the air still felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. Paulson had left. Darlene had comped his coffee just to get him out the door faster, muttering under her breath the whole time about people who didn't know how good they had it. And Malcolm was sitting in the back booth, wiping down silverware with more focus than the task required, the way people busy their hands when they don't know what to do with their feelings. "Baby," Loretta said, sliding into the booth across from him. "You okay?" Malcolm shrugged, not looking up from the fork he was polishing. "I'm okay, Mama, it's fine. People are like that sometimes." "It's not fine," Loretta said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the second word. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Malcolm said, and he did know it in the way he knew most things, clearly, honestly, without the layers of doubt and self-protection that adults tended to build around their own hurt. But knowing a thing didn't stop it from landing somewhere soft. Darlene came over and sat on the edge of the booth, arms crossed, jaw tight. "I should have thrown him out the second he opened his mouth," she said. I've got half a mind to call the Tulsa world and tell them what kind of man stays at the Hyatt. It's fine, Miss Darlene, Malcolm said again, though this time it sounded less convincing, even to him. What none of them realized was that Hank, sitting at his usual stool, had quietly made a phone call the moment Paulson walked out the door. Hank didn't say much most days. He drank his coffee, read his paper, and left a $2 tip he could barely afford on his fixed income. But Hank had a history that very few people in the diner knew about, one that went back further than most of Tulsa's newer residents could imagine, a history that involved a garage on the edge of town, motor oil on his knuckles, and a man named Curtis Whitfield. 40 years ago, before Hank's knees gave out, and before his hair went the color of ash, Hank Delaney had ridden with a motorcycle club called the Iron Kings, one of the oldest chapters in Oklahoma, founded in the years after Vietnam by veterans who came home, and found that the only people who understood them were the men who'd been standing next to them in the jungle. Curtis Whitfield had never officially patched in. He preferred wrenches to leather vests, but he'd run the garage where half the club got their bikes fixed, and more than once he'd fixed more than an engine. There'd been a night, decades back, when an Iron King named Walter Preacher Combs, no relation to Darlene, just a coincidence of Oklahoma surnames, had wrapped his bike around a guardrail on Highway 75 in the middle of a rainstorm, bleeding out fast, miles from the nearest hospital. Curtis had been the one who found him, the one who'd wrapped the wound tight enough to slow the bleeding, the one who'd driven him to the hospital himself instead of waiting on an ambulance that might not have made it in time. Preacher lived. He went on to become the club's president for the next 30 years, and Curtis Whitfield, a quiet black mechanic who never asked for anything in return, became something the Iron Kings didn't hand out lightly: family. Curtis passed away when Malcolm was 6, a heart condition nobody saw coming, quiet and sudden the way he'd lived. The club had shown up at the funeral in numbers that surprised the whole neighborhood, 200 bikes lining the street outside the church, engines silent out of respect, every rider standing at attention in the Oklahoma heat. Loretta had never forgotten it. She also hadn't seen much of them since. Grief has a way of scattering people, even people who mean well, and the years had drifted the Hendricks family and the Iron Kings apart. Hank Delaney, though, had never forgotten either, and when he watched Malcolm Whitfield, Curtis's boy, grown into a young man with his father's same patient warmth, get humiliated in the diner where he worked, Hank did the only thing that felt right. He called Preacher. "You remember Curtis Whitfield's boy?" Hank said into the phone, standing outside the diner where Malcolm couldn't hear him. "The one with Down syndrome, works at Rosie's? Some suit just told Darlene he didn't want him serving his coffee, said it right in front of everybody." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Preacher, 71 years old now, silver-bearded, still riding every day the weather allowed, said 4 words that would set the rest of the day into motion. "Give me 2 hours. What Preacher didn't tell Hank was that he wasn't planning to come alone. The Iron Kings weren't just a local chapter anymore. Over the decades, they'd become part of a much larger regional network, one that Curtis Whitfield's kindness had touched more than once over the years, in ways the Hendricks family had never fully known. Preacher made one phone call, then another. Word moved through the biker community the way it always had, faster than any social media post, chapter president to chapter president, club to club, a language built on loyalty that outsiders rarely understood and almost always misjudged. By 9:30 that morning, riders were leaving from as far away as Oklahoma City, Wichita, and Springfield, Missouri, engines roaring down the interstate in formation, patches from a dozen different clubs united by a single simple fact. Somebody had disrespected a man who deserved better, and that man was the son of somebody who'd once saved one of their own. Back at the diner, Malcolm had finally set down the fork and picked up a rag, wiping tables that didn't particularly need wiping, the lunch rush still 2 hours off. He had no idea that outside of his small, familiar world of Rosie's diner and his mother's laundromat and Hank's quiet coffee-drinking company, an entire community he barely remembered was mobilizing on his behalf. Men and women in leather vests, tattooed and weathered and loud, the very people most of Tulsa crossed the street to avoid, all of them converging on a single address with one purpose in mind: to make sure Malcolm Whitfield never had to wonder, even for a second, whether he belonged. By 11 o'clock, the diner had filled again for the early lunch crowd, and word of what had happened to Malcolm that morning had already spread through Rosie's regulars the way news travels in small, tight communities. Quietly at first, then all at once, a few customers offered Malcolm sympathetic nods. One older woman, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, who came in every day for the chicken-fried steak, patted his hand when he refilled her water glass and told him Paulson was an ill-mannered fool who didn't deserve Rosie's coffee anyway. Malcolm smiled at that genuinely, the kind of smile that came easy to him even on hard days. But not everyone was kind. Malcolm noticed, the way he always noticed things people assumed he wouldn't, that a few of the newer faces in the diner watched him a little differently now, whispered a little when he passed. The way Paulson's comment had given quiet permission to thoughts some people had been keeping to themselves. A man near the window muttered something to his companion that Malcolm didn't quite catch, but the tone of it, low and mocking, landed just the same. A woman pulled her child a little closer as Malcolm walked by with a tray of drinks, the kind of gesture that meant nothing to a stranger and everything to the person on the receiving end of it. Malcolm had learned over 24 years how to carry these moments. He'd learned it from his mother, who never let him see her cry about it, and from Darlene, who fired one waitress on the spot 3 years ago for calling him slow in the kitchen where she thought he couldn't hear. He'd learned that some people would never see past what made him different, and that the only thing he could control was how he treated them back. So he kept smiling. He kept refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, and greeting every new face like they might still turn out to be someone worth knowing, because most of the time, given the chance, they were. It was a lesson that had cost him something to learn, piece by piece, over years of small humiliations most people never noticed happening around them. A teacher in middle school who'd assumed he couldn't keep up and stopped calling on him entirely. A cousin's wedding where an uncle had pulled Loretta aside to ask, quietly, whether it was really appropriate for Malcolm to be a groomsman. None of it had broken him. But all of it had built, layer by layer, into a quiet vigilance he carried everywhere, a readiness for the moment when someone's face would change the instant they understood who he was. But by early afternoon, something in him had quietly worn thin. He found himself in the back room during a break, sitting on an overturned milk crate, staring at his own hands. They were good hands, steady, careful, capable of carrying 4 plates at once without dropping a fork. His father's hands had looked like that too, according to the one photograph Loretta kept on the mantel, a picture of Curtis in his garage, sleeves rolled up, grinning at something outside the frame. "You thinking about your daddy?" Darlene asked, leaning in the doorway. She had a way of knowing things about Malcolm before he said them out loud. "I don't remember him much," Malcolm admitted. "I remember the garage smell, and I remember somebody laughing, but I can't see his face when I try." Darlene's expression softened in a way Malcolm rarely saw from her, since she mostly kept her feelings tucked behind flour-dusted forearms and a permanently exasperated tone. "Your daddy was a good man, Malcolm. Best mechanic in this part of the state, and kinder than anybody had a right to be. Whatever that man said to you this morning, that's not who you are. That's not even close." Malcolm nodded, though the words, kind as they were, didn't quite reach the place inside him that still felt the sting of Paulson's voice, still felt the eyes of strangers who'd decided something about him before he'd said a word. "I just wish," he said quietly, "that people could meet me before they decide." Darlene didn't have an answer for that. Nobody ever really did. Outside, the afternoon sun had climbed high over Tulsa, throwing long shadows down Cherry Street, and in the distance, faint at first, then steadily louder, came a sound that most of the diner's customers mistook for a passing thunderstorm. It wasn't thunder. It was the low, layered rumble of hundreds of motorcycle engines, still miles out but closing fast, moving through the city in a formation that traffic cameras would later capture and local news stations would replay for weeks. Preacher rode at the front, silver beard whipping in the wind, flanked by the current Iron King's president, a broad-shouldered woman named Denise Okafor, who had taken over the chapter 8 years earlier and run it with a discipline that had earned her respect from clubs 3 states over. Beside her rode members of a dozen different clubs: the Iron Kings, the Copperhead Riders out of Wichita, the Route 66 Renegades from Springfield, and smaller independent riders who'd heard the call and simply shown up, because that was what the community did when one of their own, even one they'd never met, had been wronged. None of them had ever met Malcolm Whitfield. Most of them hadn't even met Curtis. But they had all, at some point, been misjudged themselves, pulled over for the way they looked, refused service, whispered about in restaurants and gas stations across a dozen states, treated as dangerous simply for existing the way they existed. They knew, better than most people ever would, what it felt like to be laughed at before you'd said a single word. Loretta was walking back toward the diner from the laundromat, planning to check on her son during his afternoon break, when she first felt the vibration under her feet. Not an earthquake, but something close to it, a low mechanical thunder rolling up through the pavement and into her chest. She stopped on the sidewalk, turned toward the sound, and watched as the first motorcycles rounded the corner onto Cherry Street, sunlight glinting off chrome, leather vests marked with patches she hadn't seen in 18 years. Her breath caught. For a moment, standing there on the sidewalk with a laundry bag still slung over one shoulder, Loretta Hendricks felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time: the unmistakable, bone-deep sensation of being remembered. She didn't know yet exactly why they'd come, but some part of her, the part that had buried a husband and raised a son alone and fought 100 small, exhausting battles on his behalf, already understood. They had come for Malcolm. Inside Rosie's diner, conversation died mid-sentence as the sound outside grew from a distant rumble into something that rattled the front windows in their frames. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. A little boy in a corner booth pressed his face to the glass, eyes wide. Darlene came out from behind the grill, wiping her hands on her apron, and walked to the door just as the first riders began pulling up along Cherry Street. Not just a few, not a dozen, but dozens, then hundreds, filling every available inch of curb space for 3 blocks in either direction, engines idling in a rolling wave of sound that seemed to have no end. Malcolm came out of the back room at the commotion, still holding a stack of clean napkins, and froze in the middle of the dining room floor. He had never seen anything like it. Row after row of motorcycles, chrome catching the afternoon light, riders in leather vests covered in patches, some old and sun-faded, some newer, all of them bearing the marks of clubs whose names Malcolm didn't recognize, but whose presence, all 400 strong, filled the street outside the diner like a slow-moving flood. Some of the diner's customers actually gasped. A man near the window instinctively reached for his phone, though whether to film or to call someone, it wasn't clear. Gregory Paulson, as it happened, had not gone far. His conference didn't start until 2, and he'd stopped at a coffee shop 2 doors down to check his email, still mildly self-satisfied about how he'd handled the morning's inconvenience. He looked up from his laptop just in time to see through the shop's front window an ocean of leather and chrome rolling to a stop directly outside Rosie's diner. His stomach did something uncomfortable. The engines began to cut off one by one. the roar fading into a strange, heavy silence. 400 riders dismounting in near unison, boots hitting pavement, a wave of quiet moving down the street like a held breath. At the front of it all, an older man with a silver beard and a weathered leather vest walked toward the diner's front door, flanked by a broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes. Darlene opened the door before he reached it. "Preacher," she said, recognizing him after all these years, her voice unsteady. "It's been a long time." "Too long, Darlene," Preacher said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying easily in the hush that had fallen over the street. His eyes moved past her, scanning the diner, and found what he was looking for near the back. A young man in a Rosie's apron, standing perfectly still, a stack of napkins forgotten in his hands. Preacher walked inside. The diner was dead silent now, every customer, every regular, even Hank at the counter watching the scene unfold. Preacher stopped a few feet from Malcolm and studied him for a long moment, something moving behind his weathered eyes. Recognition, maybe, or grief, or both. "You're Curtis's boy," Preacher said. It wasn't a question. Malcolm nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Malcolm Whitfield." "You look just like him," Preacher said, and his voice caught just slightly on the words. "Same eyes, same way of standing like you're about to say something kind." Malcolm didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had ever told him he looked like his father before. Nobody who'd actually known Curtis well enough to say it and mean it. "Your daddy saved my life," Preacher continued, loud enough now that the whole diner could hear him. 40 years ago on Highway 75, in a rainstorm that should have killed me. He didn't know me from Adam. Didn't ask what club I rode with, didn't ask why a stranger was bleeding out on the side of the road. He just stopped, wrapped my wound with his own shirt, and drove me to the hospital himself instead of waiting on an ambulance. I've got a granddaughter today because of your father, son. 3 of them, actually. A murmur moved through the diner. Loretta had slipped inside during Preacher's speech, standing near the door with tears already gathering, one hand pressed to her chest. "So when I heard," Preacher said, turning now to address the whole room, his voice hardening, "that some man walked into this diner and told my friend's son that he wasn't good enough to pour his coffee, that he'd rather have anyone else serve him because of the way this young man looks, because of who he is, I made some calls. And every single person you see standing outside this diner right now dropped what they were doing and rode here, some of them from 3 states away, because we don't let people talk about family that way. Not while we're breathing." The silence in the diner had a weight to it now, thick and charged. Somewhere near the window, Gregory Paulson had appeared, drawn back by the same instinct that draws anyone toward the scene of their own undoing, his face pale, his phone forgotten in his pocket. Preacher's sharp eyes found him instantly, as though he'd known exactly where to look. "You," he said, "grey suit, you the one who couldn't stomach a cup of coffee from this young man's hands?" Paulson opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly shrinking under the weight of 400 sets of eyes, now turning toward him through the diner's front windows. I didn't mean anything by it," Paulson stammered. "It was just a preference." "A preference," Preacher repeated, quiet and cold. "You judged a man's worth by how he looks, in a town full of people who love him, standing in a diner his employer built into a home for him, and you call that a preference." He shook his head slowly. "Let me tell you something about preferences, sir. Everybody in this room, and everybody parked outside on that street, has been judged the same way you judged this young man. Judged by our leather, our tattoos, the roar of our engines. People cross the street when they see us coming, lock their car doors, call the police just for us, existing in a parking lot. And you know what we've learned, riding for as long as we have?" He paused, letting the question settle. "The people who judge fastest are usually the ones who understand the least." Paulson said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Malcolm, still standing near the back of the diner, felt something shift inside his chest. Not vindication exactly, though there was some of that too, but something warmer, something closer to belonging. He looked out through the window at the sea of riders filling the street, people he had never met, who had come from hours away for a man they'd never known, because of a kindness his father had shown decades before he was born. "Mama," Malcolm said softly, finding Loretta's eyes across the room. "They came for me." Loretta crossed the diner floor and wrapped her arms around her son, holding on tight enough that neither of them could speak for a moment. Over her shoulder, Malcolm watched 400 strangers who somehow weren't strangers at all, standing quiet and steady in the Tulsa afternoon, having ridden across the state simply to make sure he understood once and for all exactly how much he mattered. News of what happened outside Rosie's diner spread through Tulsa faster than Darlene's coffee could cool. By that evening, a local news van had parked across the street, and a reporter named Sylvia Cortez was interviewing anyone who'd hold still long enough. Darlene, Hank, even a few of the Iron Kings, who spoke about Curtis Whitfield with a warmth and reverence that surprised the young reporter, who admitted on camera that she'd expected gruffness, not grief. Preacher gave a short statement before he left, his silver beard catching the setting sun. "People see leather and tattoos and assume the worst," he said, "same as they saw a young man with Down syndrome behind that counter and assumed he wasn't capable. We rode 400 strong today, not because we wanted attention, but because respect isn't something you get to hand out selectively. Either you treat people right or you don't. Curtis Whitfield treated me right when he had every reason not to bother. Today, we made sure his son knew that kindness doesn't disappear. It waits. And sometimes it comes back around wearing leather instead of a mechanic's uniform." Gregory Paulson left town the next morning without attending the second day of his conference. Word got back to his company, largely because Sylvia Cortez's segment ended up syndicated across 3 states, racking up more shares online than anyone at the local station had anticipated. And within a week, he'd been quietly reassigned to a different region, the kind of professional consequence that companies prefer to handle without headlines. Malcolm never asked what happened to him and never seemed particularly interested in finding out. He wasn't a man who carried grudges well, it simply wasn't in his nature. What mattered more to Malcolm in the weeks that followed was what stayed. Preacher and Denise Okafor came back to the diner the following Sunday, not with 400 riders this time, just the two of them, sitting at the counter like regular customers, ordering coffee and eggs from Malcolm with genuine warmth, asking him questions about his day, his job, the things he liked to do outside of work. Malcolm told them he liked drawing motorcycles, actually, always had, ever since he was a kid, though he'd never told anyone why. Preacher laughed at that, a real laugh, and promised to bring him a stack of old photographs of Curtis's garage the next time he visited, photographs Loretta had never seen, taken by club members decades ago, showing a young Curtis Whitfield laughing over an engine with grease on his hands and pride written plainly across his face. The photographs arrived 2 weeks later. Loretta cried over them at the kitchen table while Malcolm studied each one carefully, memorizing a face he'd been trying to remember his whole life. In one photo, Curtis stood with his arm around a much younger preacher, both men grinning at whoever was holding the camera. Malcolm asked if he could keep that one for himself, and Loretta didn't hesitate. She had the picture framed the following week and set it on Malcolm's nightstand, right beside his alarm clock, so it would be the last thing he saw before sleep and the first thing he saw each morning. Darlene, for her part, put a small sign near the diner's front door that read, "Everyone who walks through this door gets treated like family. No exceptions." Malcolm helped her paint it himself, his lettering a little uneven but entirely sincere, and customers took photos of it for years afterward, some of them sharing the story online alongside the local news segment, which had, by then, been viewed by people well beyond Oklahoma's borders. The Iron Kings started a small tradition after that, a monthly ride they called Curtis's Run, ending every time at Rosie's Diner, where 40 or 50 riders would crowd into the booths and along the counter, ordering more pancakes than the kitchen could reasonably keep up with, always making sure to ask for Malcolm by name. He came to know most of them personally within a few months, their names, their bikes, the particular way each of them took their coffee. He was, by unofficial but unanimous agreement, the only person outside the club allowed to touch Preacher's motorcycle without asking permission first, an honor that meant more to Malcolm than almost anything else that had happened to him that year. Loretta watched her son grow steadier in the months that followed, not because the ugliness in the world had disappeared. It hadn't, and she knew better than to expect it ever fully would, but because Malcolm had been given something rare and durable, proof, undeniable and witnessed by an entire street full of strangers, that he belonged exactly as he was, no explanation required, no apology necessary. She noticed it in small ways. He stood a little taller behind the counter now. When a new customer occasionally hesitated the way Paulson once had, Malcolm no longer flinched inward the way he used to. He simply kept smiling, patient and unbothered, the way a man stands when he already knows, deep down, exactly what he's worth, and doesn't need a stranger's approval to confirm it. Darlene noticed it too, and told Loretta more than once that she'd never seen Malcolm work with more confidence, more ease, as though some old quiet weight had finally been set down. Ruth, the retired schoolteacher, started bringing her grandchildren by the diner on weekends, just so they could meet Malcolm, telling them afterward in the car that he was one of the kindest people she'd ever known, and that kindness like his was worth more than any test score she'd spent 30 years grading. Hank kept his same stool at the counter, kept ordering his same coffee, but he smiled a little more these days, satisfied in the quiet way of a man who'd made one phone call that mattered more than he'd expected it to. One evening, months later, as the two of them sat on the porch the way they always had, Malcolm turned to his mother with the same open, easy curiosity he brought to everything. "Mama," he said, "do you think Daddy knew that what he did for Preacher would come back around like that?" Loretta thought about it for a long moment, watching the Oklahoma sky turn orange and violet over the rooftops. "I don't think your daddy ever did a kind thing hoping it would come back to him," she said finally. "I think he just did it because it was right. That's what kindness like his does, though, baby. It doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to come home." Malcolm nodded slowly, turning that thought over the way he turned over most things, carefully, thoroughly, without any of the cynicism the rest of the world seemed to carry so easily. Somewhere down the street, faint but unmistakable, the low rumble of a single motorcycle passed by, and Malcolm smiled, the way he always did now at that sound, no longer a stranger's noise, but something closer to a familiar voice, calling out to remind him, again and again, exactly where he belonged.